Good evening. Welcome to the first in the series of 7 faculty lectures that are for the purpose of celebrating the centennial of St. Joseph's College. I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Ed Rielly. He's a professor of English here at St. Joseph's College. He holds a doctorate degree from the University of Notre Dame. He joined the faculty at St. Joseph's College in 1978, and he served as chairperson of the English department and dean of the Distance Learning Division. He's the author or editor of approximately 24 books, including several collections of his own poetry. His books include biographies of F. Scott Fitzgerald and Sitting Bull, books about baseball and football, an examination of the popular culture of the 1960s, and studies of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver Travels and detective fiction. His most recent books are Legends of the American Indian Resistance, which examines a dozen major Indian leaders, and To Sadie at 18 Months, and Other Poems, which consists of poems written about his youngest grandchild. Dr. Rielly has won awards for his poetry and also for his teaching. He teaches courses in writing, literature, linguistics, film, and popular culture. This evening, Dr. Rielly will be discussing language change, a slippery slope or change we can believe in.
Yeah, I think that's on. I guess it is. Well, thank you for coming. I'm really pleased with the large turnout. If you haven't picked up one of these sheets, you're welcome to do that. It's an annotated bibliography of several recent works on the English language. Tonight I plan to discuss the English language in keeping with the title of our centennial celebration, Realize the Promise. I plan to speak about how, over many centuries, we speakers of English have realized the promise of our language, but also how we have kept at bay some of the promise of our language due to attitudes about language change. I oppose my title, Language Change, a Slippery Slope or Change We Can Believe in, as a question involving two extremes. We probably all are familiar with the metaphor, maybe really more of a cliche, of the slippery slope. Once we start down a path, our momentum propels us forward as if we were sliding down an icy hill. There's no braking, no stopping, and we end in a ditch or wrapped around a tree. So we might ask whether we really want our beloved language in a ditch or smashed into a tree trunk. On the other hand, language change may be good, positive, something in which we can believe, taking a phrase from the most recent presidential election. Should we start down that hill of language change at all? Of course, we have started down it. Our ancestors, many times removed, started down it. Is there no going back, or at least the ability to put on the brakes? Or do we want to do that? Should we try? Should we go with the flow? See where we end up? Although there will never be any ending up so long as English is spoken. And embrace, even revel in, what our language becomes. There may, of course, be a midpoint, but that's for a few minutes later. In order to get to some possible answers, let's reflect a bit on what language is. First of all, language is what we speak, not what we write. That statement may surprise some people. So let's consider a few statistics. There are about 6,000 languages spoken today. Of that total, only about 200 are written to any significant extent. Although no one can possibly know when language was first spoken, a growing consensus of linguists now believe that language use goes back at least 80,000 years, maybe much farther back than that even. Writing, however, has occurred for just some 5,500, maybe 6,000 years. Regardless of the date of language origin, even if we place it much closer to us in time, writing obviously has taken place over a very short fraction of the time that people have been speaking. Linguists largely agree on many characteristics of language, but writing is not one of them. Even within our families, we know that children learn to speak quite well before they can write anything. By the age of 5, most humans have learned the basic rules of language grammar. Writing is not part of language, but rather a way of representing language. Writing, of course, is obviously very important today for many reasons, and writing has certainly affected language, starting far back, certainly with the introduction of printing presses. Well, what else can we say with reasonable certainty about language? Here's a sampling of language characteristics. All languages change over time so long as they continue to be spoken. Writing slows down that change because it tends to help standardize a language. But it does not stop all change. In addition, the relationship between words and their meaning, that is, the objects, actions, phenomena, and so forth, to which the words refer, is generally arbitrary. There is no intrinsic relationship, for example, between the sounds of the word giraffe and that animal with a long neck. The word, of course, has its etymology, that is its history, but it has no intrinsic relationship to the object that it names. This arbitrary relationship between word and meaning, with a few exceptions, such as a word like buzz, is universally accepted by linguists. In addition to language change and arbitrariness, a language also makes use of a finite number of sounds, or in the case of sign language, gestures, that may be combined in a virtually infinite number of ways to create words and sentences. That quality is often referred to as language creativity. In that sense, all language users are creative. So if you've never thought of yourself as creative, you should do so now. Try it sometime when you have nothing else to do. Sit down at your computer and keep composing different sentences that you never wrote before until somebody comes back to your room and tells you to get a life. Still further, language is biologically determined. By that I mean that we are genetically constructed to learn language. However, something apparently must trigger that biological potential so that the child learns a specific language. That triggering mechanism is simply hearing language spoken around him or her during the years between birth and middle childhood. All children, except those who have suffered some sort of brain defect through illness or through an injury, will learn language if they hear it spoken. Furthermore, they tend to move ahead at their own pace. Correcting the young child on fine points of grammar seems not to be very effective, although most of us parents never quite stop trying that anyway. Now, the language that the child learns, no matter which language, includes 5 basic subsystems. The first one is morphology, which refers to the creation of words. The second is syntax, that is putting the words together in larger units, such as clauses and sentences. The third is phonology, which refers to the sounds of language. The fourth is semantics, which refers to the meaning of words and to the meaning of larger units, such as phrases and sentences. And finally, lexicon, which is the list of words and the smaller units that make up words, what are called morphemes. Now, all languages have these components. In that sense, all languages are complete because they all have these same components. Although some languages may be more complex or difficult to learn in one or more of these areas. The young child learns these 5 subsystems of language. That is the grammar of language. You may wonder, a young child knows grammar? Absolutely. My youngest grandchild, who will be 4 years old in about a month, knows basically the whole grammar of English. She certainly is very verbal. I think her parents would say a little too verbal at times, but she's not unique in this regard. She shares with other young children that understanding of language grammar. So one definition of grammar is the individual's total knowledge of a language, including the morphology, the syntax, and so forth. And that language knowledge is basically complete, as I said earlier, by about the age of 5, although it's going to vary a little bit with each child. The child will continue to add words, as all of us do, forget some words, get better at putting together long sentences and so forth. But that young child, at about 5, has the basic grammar of the language. What the child at 5 cannot do, what my grandchild cannot do, is pass a grammar test. That's because when I speak of a grammar test, I have switched to a different meaning of grammar. I've used it in the way that we teachers usually use that word. There's something of a dichotomy between linguists and grammar teachers. The former usually define grammar as I explained it a moment ago. All of the rules, yes, rules, but descriptive rules that constitute a language. A grammar teacher or grammar book usually defines grammar more narrowly to focus on morphology and syntax. That is, the creation of words and how to put them into larger units, along, of course, with some punctuation included. In addition, linguists focus much more on language itself, which we speak, while teachers of grammar usually concern themselves primarily with how students write. And writing, remember, is not language, but the representation of language. Still, another important distinction between linguists and teachers of traditional schoolroom grammar is that the former usually are descriptive, the latter prescriptive. Descriptive teaching involves describing the way a language is. Prescriptive teaching tells students how language should be and offers a prescription for speaking, but more often writing proper, that is, standard English. Let me come back to that matter of rules. Once again, I will say that the child of 5 already knows most of the rules of grammar, the grammar of the child's language. However, if we consider the rules of grammar as laid out in grammar books, the child's knowledge certainly is deficient. I wonder if any of you know how many textbook rules of grammar there are. Does anybody know how many rules of textbook grammar there are? Nobody wants to answer, right? Well, I'll tell you, in a book entitled A Comprehensive, and that term is right, comprehensive, A Comprehensive Grammar of the English Language, published in 1985, and numbering 1,779 pages, the authors enumerate 3,500 rules of grammar. I bet you all wish you could make, that your life work, accumulating all of those rules of grammar. Yes, my granddaughter doesn't know all of them. Actually, she probably couldn't name a single one of them. Yet she has sufficiently internalized the basic rules of grammar, the first kind of grammar, to speak quite well. Now, is something out of whack here? Now, many of these rules, including some near and dear to the hearts of grammarians, are, in the words of Henry Hitchings, author of The Language Wars, phony rules. Let's take the command to avoid split infinitives. That is, to avoid putting an adverb between the word to, T-O, and the main part of the verb. An example provided by Mr. Hitchings is to really do it. Consider how that split infinitive compares in meaning with two unsplit infinitives. To really do it, really to do it, to do it really. Notice each expression has a somewhat different meaning. The split version, to really do it, exceeds the others, I think, in implied determination to actually carry out that action. So if I need something done, give me someone who is willing to really do it. Okay? Now, the split infinitive has been around at least since Chaucer in the 14th century. Its many manifestations over the centuries include the renowned lead-in to the classic television show Star Trek, which informs us that the crew of the Starship Enterprise has set out, and I quote, first couple infinitives are not split, to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations. And some of you know what's coming now. Here we get the split infinitive. I hear it there, yes. To boldly go where no man has gone before. David Christo argues in his book, The Fight for English, that the split infinitive is actually the norm, the natural way to speak, and defends his assertion not only by pointing out the construction's long history, but also its suitability for an English language that is largely iambic. That is, a pattern of, as all my students here know, of unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Notice the iambic pattern of to boldly go. That's the basic pattern of most English speech. So why the condemnation of split infinitives? Actually, the rule did not come about until the 19th century, some 1,400 years after the birth of English. The rule arose, as have quite a number of other rules, because people wanted English to be more Latin. At a time when Latin enjoyed a lot more cultural clout than it does today. We don't split infinitives in Latin, so we should not do it in English. That was the thinking. Never mind that one cannot possibly split an infinitive in Latin because the infinitive is one word. We won't let logic or reason interfere with making up rules. Let's take another of our forbidden actions, one of our grammar sins, ending a sentence with a preposition. Yes. Yet, like the split infinitive, the end preposition has been around a long time. Listen to a couple lines from Shakespeare's great to be or not to be speech in Hamlet. By a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. Yeah. Or, the dread of something after death makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Yeah, some of you know your Shakespeare. Now here's a common type of sentence. Which of these sounds better to you? That's the person to whom I was talking. That's the person I was talking to. Doesn't the second sound more natural, more real? And of course it ends with a preposition. By the 18th century, prescriptive grammarians were up to their elbows in removing supposed impurities from English in order to make the language more Latin-like. A preposition in a final position was judged to be one of those impurities, because after all, that is not where a preposition is found in Latin. In Latin, that type of function word occurs prior to the noun. The reason why it is called a, visualize the word, preposition, preposition. As we put on fine clothes to make us appear more than we are, so grammarians such as Robert Louth and Lindley Murray in the 18th century clothed English in Latin garb to make the language appear better than it was, more noble, more proper, purer. Elevating English was only half of the battle. Keeping it there was the other half. A prescriptive approach more or less tries to freeze the language based on a long-standing view, a really ancient view, that natural language change is really language degeneration. The rules are to be followed, not just the rules that my granddaughter has internalized, but also those textbook rules that truly have little to do with the other type of rules. Such real descriptive rules can be, and of course are, described by linguists. For example, the subject typically precedes the verb. She sings, not sings she. That's the way our language has developed. The child hears English spoken that way, speaks that way as well. The linguist says that this is a descriptive rule. It is not necessarily a better way to conduct a sentence, but it's the way we do it. And if we don't do it that way, we're going to have trouble being understood. This prescriptive approach leads us to get very upset with people who do not follow the rules. Let me cite one expert, a man named E.L. Godkin, who was the founder of the magazine The Nation. He wrote an essay entitled The Growing Illiteracy of American Boys. He complains especially that college students lack sound language skills, are in fact, as the title indicates, virtually illiterate. He published this essay in 1896. The nefarious college students, Harvard undergraduates. The antipathy that many people have for any deviation from the rules, and by extension to any language change, is described thusly by John McWhorter in a great book, What Language Is and What It Isn't and What It Could Be. So I quote McWhorter, that Shakespeare spoke a different English from Chaucer is considered luscious. That people 50 years from now might speak slightly differently from us is considered a herald to the demise of civilization as we know it. I keep pulling this little thing. The technology people warned me not to drop this on the floor, for fear I would share some English with you I don't really want to share, right? So explaining why people get quite passionate about language is not always easy, although there certainly are reasons. We see our language as part of our national identity. We make moral judgments about people on the basis of how they speak and write. Much of our passion concerning language occurs when we encounter what we conclude to be a deviation from the standard. That is to say, change. The change has been occurring in English since its birth. Let's take a few minutes to reflect on that enormous change. Perhaps as long as 7,000 years ago, initially somewhere in Western Asia or Eastern Europe, people were speaking what today we call Proto-Indo-European, which gave rise to the language family that includes English. By about 3,000 years before Christ, those speakers were beginning their migration along paths that would take them throughout Europe and part of Asia. One branch of this language was Germanic. About the time of Christ, Germanic, which was probably still one language then with a number of dialects, began to yield versions that were sufficiently different from each other to be individual, although still related languages. The languages became known as East Germanic, North Germanic, and West Germanic. The West Germanic languages include German, Dutch, Yiddish, and several more, including, of course, English. In the middle of the 5th century, you're getting the fastest trip through history ever here. In the middle of the 5th century, England, a power vacuum having been created by the departure of the Romans, saw several groups arriving from Western Europe principally from Jutland and Saxony to today, Denmark and northern Germany. These people, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, spoke similar dialects. They intermarried with each other and with natives, the Celts, and came to understand each other better as their dialects evolved. Their speaking growing more distant from what their ancestors had spoken on the continent. Before long, as language evolution goes, they were speaking what we consider a new language, English. That first version of English is usually called Old English, sometimes Anglo-Saxon, and was a truly formed language by about the year 600 AD, with, however, various dialects. It was remarkably different from what we speak today, an inflected language rather than the current word order type of English. In other words, people added endings to words in order to show how they were being used as a subject, in possession, as a direct object, and so on. There were four major noun cases, and sometimes a fifth, the instrumental, each with its set of word endings that also varied with gender and number. Studying Old English today involves learning lots of sets of declensions and conjugations. It's a lot like studying a foreign language, which it looks and sounds like, without being one. It really is English, but an early version of the language. Then came the Norman invasion of 1066 with the ascendancy of French. French became the language of the court, the law, the upper classes, the language of anyone who was anybody. Peasants spoke English. Gradually, however, animosity between England and France developed, leading to the 100 Years' War that began in 1337 between England and France. The French language gradually came to be seen as the language of the enemy, and an English for the English movement picked up steam. By 1362, English had been designated the official legal language of the country. However, during these years that constitute the later Middle Ages, English, partly under the influence of French, and partly due to the simplifying force of foreigners learning English so they could order their servants around, the language changed a lot. It became a lot easier. Most of the word endings dropped off. The English of Chaucer in the 14th century, for example, sounds very different from ours, but is generally readable by people today. Chaucer's dialect, the East Midland dialect, was one of several Middle English dialects, Middle English being the name given to that second version of English, which was spoken between roughly 1100 and 1500. By the 16th century, English was largely what it is today. Shakespeare, despite the difficulties some people have with his language, did not write Old English. He wrote modern or New English, but is sometimes called Early New English. English, of course, has continued to change since Shakespeare's time, in part because of that plethora of rules that started coming into existence in the 18th century. Shakespeare, for example, was comfortable with the double superlative, now along with the double comparative, considered substandard. Again, I'll quote Shakespeare. Edgar in King Lear promises to take the basest and most poorest state. Most poorest state. We'd have to get out our red pencils and correct that, wouldn't we? He also invented a whole lot of words, some 1,700, but half of which, word like accommodation, becoming more or less permanent. Today, we would be quick to remind a speaker that what she is using is not a word. We like inventions, but not in language. Noah Webster, the first great American lexicographer, took it upon himself in his compendious dictionary of 1806 to alter the spelling of many words. Isn't that great? I've decided I'm going to change the way people spell words. He dropped the U in some spellings such as color, C-O-L-O-U-R, becoming C-O-L-O-R. He changed the R-E at the end of words, center, for example, to E-R. He eliminated many silent letters, including the final U-E in catalog, although you can still find that as an alternate spelling. He also deserves credit for removing final K's in words, so music no longer ends with a K, and eliminating Q-U-E, so when you make out your check, it's not a C-H-E-Q-U-E anymore. With Webster, we clearly are moving from British English to American English, not a new language, but certainly a different dialect of it. Words naturally keep flowing into our language or taking on new meanings. A few decades ago, you would hardly have admitted having a mouse on your desk, let alone in your house. Now, we accept that, so long as the word gets sanctioned formally in a new dictionary, for instance. Although great battles have been fought about words that have been included in dictionaries. But what if the only thing sanctioning a new word or grammatical usage is that it is actually being used a lot? That's what we face today. Should language be democratic with a small d? For a democratic people, we can be awfully elitist where language is concerned. Let's take up the possessive word there, T-H-E-I-R. Traditional prescriptive grammar says that there is a plural pronoun and therefore must refer to a plural antecedent. For example, all of the students earned their certificates. But what happens when we use a singular antecedent that actually refers to a group consisting of both males and females, as in the sentence, each person earned fill in the blank certificate. The each is traditionally construed to be singular, even though we are talking about a group. But what pronoun goes in the blank? Once upon a time, the male pronoun would have been used. Each person earned his certificate. The justification was that the male pronoun not only refers to males, but also to any group that consists of both females and males. Today, that construction is usually viewed as sexist. The implied attitude is that women exist only by virtue of their somehow standing within the shadow of men, and therefore inching within the umbrella coverage of the male pronoun. They themselves do not have any meaningful separate existence. Most publishers and organizations that work with the public, of course, have adopted non-sexist language. So what do we do about pronouns? One option is to say, each person earned his or her certificate. Non-sexist, but certainly awkward. Or we can live permanently in the plural. Or we can take an existing pronoun, maybe there, T-H-E-I-R, and use it. Each person earned their certificate. Now, two groups of individuals often use this hitherto plural there this way. One group consists of linguists who feel much less fettered by past rules, knowing as they do that language constantly changes, so why not this change, which clearly meets a currently unmet need? The second group of people using there this way is just about everybody, except some editors and folks who still believe that what's once existed should remain unchanged and unchanging. Remember, the sounds that make up the word there do not inherently mean plural. There has moved rapidly and naturally into this role. Just try noting the times when you hear there as a singular. So what is the answer about language change? If words are arbitrary, and many of the so-called rules, inventions based on false premises? Should we abandon rules altogether? Let anything go? Is that the slippery slope of my title? Other permissiveness, of course, leads to chaos, to miscommunication, to a lack of clarity, and ultimately to a complete inability to communicate with one another. On the other hand, it's a good thing we have only two hands, isn't it? Because there was one, and on the other hand. Why could we go on forever? On the 10th hand. On the other hand, a determined resistance to all change, except perhaps some additions to the lexicon, seriously ignores both the nature of all languages that are still spoken and the history of English. It also leads to misjudgments about people who deviate from our rules. People speak in a lot of ways. English consists of many dialects. Some dialects are regional, while others are based on age, profession, anything that sets one group somewhat apart from the others in how they speak. And remember, the dialect is not merely how we pronounce words. Dialects have their distinguishing features in the other areas as well, such as syntax, morphology, and so forth. You say bag, I say sock. In addition, each person has their somewhat peculiar version of a dialect known as an idiolect. But we should be careful about those judgments we make based on how people speak. A speaker of Black English, also known as Ebonics or African American English, is not therefore less intelligent or literate than a speaker of Standard English, which, by the way, is not all that standard except in textbooks. All dialects are equal in that they possess the same elements that I have repeatedly cited, morphology, syntax, and the others. All languages also have all of these elements, and therefore are equal in the sense of being complete. Some languages and dialects may be more complex than others, but modern English, remember, is far less complex than Old English. Have we really declined as human beings since the Old English period? Our society, however, for various reasons, has decreed that a certain type of English, what we call standard spoken and written English, is more appropriate in professional settings. We may not like that, but it's a fact. Do we ignore that fact? Of course not. I don't want my students to suffer rejection when they apply to graduate school or for a job because they cannot speak and write the type of English that people in those institutions and professions want them to know. So how about a middle ground? I think that we should recognize that there are many Englishes, and that it's perfectly all right to speak and write them at different times and places, within differing contexts, and with different audiences in mind. Students should learn and teachers should teach the nature of language, something of the history of English, and Standard English. We should apply not the principle of superiority, but the principle of appropriateness. Certain types of speaking and writing are appropriate in certain situations and not in others. The most important rules are those that my granddaughter already knows. Many of the textbook rules, to be fair to them and to grammarians, are based on those rules that we learn more or less automatically as children. The subject does usually come before the verb. The textbook tells us, and that is descriptive of what English today is like. There's nothing essentially superior about that word order, but if we changed it too much or too quickly, we wouldn't be able to communicate well with each other. Remember that Standard English is actually one of the dialects of English. For a long time, it was viewed as the only proper, correct form of English, and in any place, any time, if you didn't use standard English, you were bad. Now, it's a mistake to see standard English as the only real English, for it is not. Nor is it the only inherently correct English. It is the type of English based on societal expectations appropriate in certain contexts. If everyone decided that henceforth our standard would be a Down East Maine dialect, or English spoken by many people in Georgia or in southern Indiana, we as a people would be no less intelligent, no less literate, no less moral, no less proper. So I suggest that we learn the standard and be able to use it, understand that it is not inherently superior to other versions. Feel free to communicate in other ways at other times and be open to change. Let us not worry about split infinitives and whether we're ending a sentence with a preposition, so long as our utterances sound natural and are clear. Perhaps the day will also come when no one need fear using their, T-H-E-I-R, with a singular reference, even in polite company. As I was coloring a picture of Cinderella and the prince a few days ago with my granddaughter, she said, "Mommy and me stayed home yesterday." I bit my lip. For the grammarian and a veteran English teacher dies hard, and did not correct her. She will learn soon enough, even without a grammar book. And I can hope that she may even embrace their. May we all have a good influence on our grandchildren. Thank you.